Everything is chaos, Ned.
Yeah, the news has been hopping.
No, I mean at work. I don't even know how many servers I have.
Have you tried Fathom? It can describe and map your applications to your infrastructure. You can learn more at the break.
When you're a developer running on Kubernetes, the developers are containerized.
Welcome to Day 2 DevOps, where the dev oops is in the details. I'm Kyler Middleton, and with me, my affable co-host, Ned Bellavance. Hey, Ned.
Hey, Kyler. Am I affable? I guess I can aff with the best of them. Today, we're talking to Elad Ben-Israel about his former startup Wingcloud and the language they built, Winglang. Let's start this postmortem.
Thank you for coming on the show, Elad. I saw your LinkedIn post that Wingcloud had shut down. I'm so sorry that it did. I know founders pour so much into their startups, but I would love to hear about what was Wingcloud for? What was your goal?
Thanks for having me. Nice to be here. Yeah, it's been a while since that happened, actually. So I had quite a lot of time to reflect and think about that amazing experience. It's been 3 years in the making. So
Wow.
it hasn't been an abrupt process. But basically, the background for Wing Cloud is I used to work for AWS and built this tool called the Cloud Development Kit, CDK.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure some of the folks are familiar with it. And so that's been kind of like my baby at Amazon and kind of moved over to AWS to open source it. And it became pretty useful and solved a real world problem for DevOps people and, cloud engineers. And for me, it was kind of like this obsession about modeling my entire application. So coming from kind of like a cloud centric design philosophy that's like very strong at Amazon and AWS, my thinking was that when you're building cloud applications, you have your infrastructure, but you also have your application code, and they work together. They're not completely decoupled.
Right.
And this decoupling is kind of like artificial. It's coming from like our history of creating software where we had like servers and we had data centers, and then we have developers writing code for, that run on those servers. And so this boundary between the application and the infrastructure was almost physical. It was physical and then almost physical and then not physical at all, right? My thinking was like, if we're able to create a programming model that will combine those two things together, it'll remove a lot of the friction that exists when you decouple those things, right? Like for example, when I'm designing my application and my application uses cloud resources to operate, the interaction between the application and the cloud resources requires a lot of boilerplate and kind of like permissions, and your application needs to know the name of the resource in order to be able to access it. So if it runs in different environments, you need to start managing all those configuration files and blah, blah, blah. And so if you're able to model your world, your application and your infrastructure together in the same space, then all of those things are just implementation details.
Right, right.
And so that was the premise of Wing, basically.
If I think about what an application needs in order to successfully access an S3 bucket, like real simple example,
Yeah.
creating that bucket and then properly setting the policies for that application, giving it the correct role and the correct policy, it gets complicated really quickly. And to make sure
Yeah.
you're doing it right is very difficult. I don't know if I would necessarily trust a developer to do that correctly because of all the toggles and settings and stuff that exist with an S3 bucket.
Yeah, and one of the ideas we had with Wing was that what we decouple is not the application and the infrastructure. What we decouple is what we called it basically the platform and the application. And so the definition of what a platform is, for example, your security policies and your compliance policies and your deployment policies, like all those things, those are part of your platform, right? Like those are the aspects of your system that you want managed by the DevOps team or the platform team or the folks whose responsibility is that layer. But then when a developer wants to use an S3 bucket, the bucket itself has a functionality in their application. And so they know that they need this type of resource in their application, and they're able to like define it and use it very intuitively and very seamlessly. And the platform team is able to apply all their policies on that application in a very clean way. Because again, I agree with you. I think like it's not that there is no decoupling, it's just the decoupling is not happening in the right layer, right?
Mm.
If that makes any sense. I don't know if it's
No, it does. And I think, yeah, you're creating a distinction here that's important and setting out some responsibilities for the platform team. The DevOps team is still responsible for setting these best practices and policies, but you want to reduce the friction that a developer experiences when they want to leverage cloud resources.
Exactly. And I have to say that, there were so many coin drops for me kind of getting into Wing and after leaving Amazon and kind of starting to learn about the real world. And I think one of them is this, by the way, right? Like this decoupling between platform and application. Because at Amazon, there's no decoupling, right? Like at Amazon, there's like a single type of engineer and there's no DevOps, right? Like there's no
Hmm.
platform team, there's no DevOps. Like there's a very kind of strong sense of full stack ownership, especially at AWS, which is obviously at AWS, they're building infrastructure. And so it makes sense that every developer will know how to configure a VPC, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not true for if you go to a bank or if you go to a, an entertainment business. And so like that was my first coin drop is like, oh, wait, it doesn't make sense that the developer in the bank will know how to configure a VPC, right? Like that was something that was kind of like culturally misaligned, right? Like a blind spot for me coming after 7 years building cloud systems at Amazon. So that was one aspect. And we definitely kind of built Wing to support this. I think the other thing that was even harder, and I guess one of the reasons we closed the company eventually was that enabling developers to use a big amount of cloud services in their applications or giving them complete independence or giving them autonomy using cloud services is a big enterprise problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It takes a very big company to get to a point where they really want to start handing off responsibilities for, like, there's this kind of like this sweet spot of growth where the DevOps team is unable to support the company, right? Like, and then they basically say, okay, let's start creating these templates, let's start giving developers more responsibilities. So there's this like tipping point where this becomes unmanageable, but it takes quite a long time. Like I think like, most of the small and medium-sized companies, they don't really have that pain because they're like, okay, I guess the DevOps team will create my bucket, right? Like it's not a big deal. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and so for us, it was really hard as a startup because selling to smaller companies and medium-sized companies and kind of like going bottom up from a go-to-market perspective is very natural for a startup because a startup is also a small company, right? Like, so for them, it's like you can kind of like create open source and put it out there and give developers the ability to start using it. And so if you're solving a problem that works for like these smaller and medium-sized companies, then you have an easier path or like clearer path to going into market. But if your solution is mostly solving problems for larger companies, then your whole mindset about how to go to market is very, very different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a very different methodology. And I think it took us a long time to figure that out. As a first-time founder, I'm just learning all of those things, right? Like I've never done this before. I've never sold anything in my life to anyone. And so for me, it was like a huge growth experience and learning experience. Like, okay, understanding this took me, I think, a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other thing that happened is that we were able to start the company in a very different climate from in terms of like startup money fundraising perspective. It was like 2020, end of 2021, and it was really easy to raise a lot of money. I mean, easy, it wasn't hard to raise a lot of money in that time, and we weren't forced to have like a clear business story behind the company.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's changing. I think it's definitely changed. I don't know if maybe it's now happening again with AI. So it's kind of like this cycle. But it definitely changed, during the next couple of years for Wing. And if I'm super kind of honest with myself about the main reason Wing failed is because we didn't solve a really business critical problem.
Mm.
The problem that we solved was like a problem that engineers had, the DevOps had. Like it was a problem. It's not that people didn't have that pain, but it's not a pain that most businesses in that size consider as business critical.
Gotcha.
And that's a really, really important ingredient in like the problem that you're trying to solve as a startup. Because if you're not solving a problem that's like keeping the C-level up at night, right? If you're not solving a problem that is business critical, why would they go to like this crappy little startup in Tel Aviv and use their tool to build their entire cloud system, right? Like it's like it doesn't make any sense. So that was, I think, the biggest problem. And once I kind of figured that out, we felt it's kind of like a dead end for the project because there's no way we couldn't find, and we definitely spent almost a year trying to figure out a pivot or kind of like a way to repackage it or maybe sell it to platform engineers, to platform teams, or create an IDP from it, right? Like we had like many different, trying to figure out a way and a path within this industry. And eventually we realized, okay, there's no problem. We couldn't find a problem space, a problem in this industry that we're excited about, that we're passionate about enough, like we were for Wing. And then it felt like instead of like wasting all the money, we just burned half of the money, which is a lot.
I wonder to what degree the AI of it all kind of sucked all the air out of the room for other projects too. Because if you're talking about the thing that's keeping the C-level folks up at night, it's are we adopting AI fast enough
Right.
versus our competitors? And that has just taken up so much room in people's consciousness that I think it hurt a lot of startups that had the potential to grow and turn into something viable given enough time and funding.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely AI happened during that time. And it sucked all the air from the customers, but it also sucked a lot of the air from us.
Hmm.
Because as a developer, I've been programming since I was 10, and I still feel there's like this fundamental shaking of like all my beliefs as a developer. Like AI has been kind of shaking a lot of those kind of core foundation that I grew up on and I really believed in, like even something like an abstraction layer, right? Like this concept of a layer of abstraction that takes the intent from one side and converts it to the intent of the underlying layer. And if you think about infrastructure as code, for example, that's an abstraction layer, right? Like it takes the intent of you're describing how you want your cloud system to look like, and this an infrastructure tool takes it and translates it into like the machine API calls that need to happen in order for that thing to happen. So even that, you're like, is this really something we will need in the future? Like you're asking yourself these like fundamental questions about abstraction and about programming and about the role of like maybe we have all these redundant layers. Maybe in the future, maybe we're going into a world where we have very high level intent that converts into very low level implementation, and everything in between is just not needed anymore.
Right.
And so that's been also really kind of sucking the air out of us in a sense. It's like, okay, are we even playing in a space that has a future? I don't know the answer, right? Like it's definitely not gone.
You covered so much ground, even though it ultimately didn't work out. Are you thinking that folks should be combining their application code with their infrastructure code? Just something super basic like that. Have you been converted to that way of thinking now?
It's a really good question because I have this new startup now and we're building something new. And now I'm like just using the cloud and using, right? Like I'm now on the other side, right? And as I said, like I think we don't have any pain. Like we need a bucket. We go to S3, we go to AWS, which is like new buckets. Okay, now we have a bucket. Great. Maybe next time we need the bucket is like 2 months from now. And who knows if we'll even exist, right? And so all I can say is that some of the mindset that you kind of learn when you work in big tech, like Amazon or, in a big enterprise, and like all these like day two kind of thinking, right? Because I think like a lot of those concepts a lot of those practices come from lessons learned of like many, many years of day two operations of cloud systems. But then when you go and you build a company from the ground up, and you're basically the only important thing is to get into the market, sell something, see that you have any legitimacy of like waking up tomorrow, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then you throw all those things away because you know that they're not going to be important if you're not going to exist next year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then slowly you're kind of bringing them in, right? Like it's like we just had a conversation today about testing, right? We have very, very, very limited amount of testing at this point because we understand that if we're creating a lot of tests, it means that we also need to like maintain those tests. And if everything is changing all the time, then we're just going to spend most of the time just rewriting the test because the entire surface is not clear. And so it's a pragmatic decision to say, okay, instead of writing tests, we're going to do some manual testing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll allow us to run much faster. But then at some point you get to like, our manual test takes an hour now to run every time. And now, okay, let's start creating some regression testing and let's start building some infrastructure for that and blah, 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 blah. Which I think is the right way to do it, right? Like I feel like that's what we need to do right now.
Right.
Have you tried Fathom?
Not sure. I mean, I'm really into the MCU and I love Carly Rae Jepsen.
No, not fandom, Ned. Fathom. Their platform helps you discover and map your applications across any infrastructure, on prem, cloud, or hybrid. They can map your environment in under 60 minutes, building a unified source of truth for your IT ops, development, and cyber teams.
Yeah, but I bet they need an agent deployed on every machine and domain admin privileges. I've got enough agents on my boxes. Thanks.
Surprisingly, no. The discovery is network based and doesn't require an agent or credentials beyond flow records.
Well, I guess then I'm giving my data to another SaaS.
Not at all. Fathom runs on a self hosted system and your data stays inside your organization. Even their AI offerings don't send your data off to Fathom servers.
Well, what kind of AI are we talking about?
They've got Lighthouse AI for anomaly detection and Compass AI for plain English queries. You don't have to be an infrastructure expert to find out what the heck the Dev2 Thanos server is up to.
It is always a good idea to keep an eye on Thanos. Sounds pretty cool. I'll call them. Maybe.
And if this sounds interesting to you, dear listener at home, you can check out Fathom on fathom.com. That's FADDOM.com. You can start free for 14 days, no sales call needed. And they even have a free version.
And I'm going to check out fathom.com right now. It makes me think of like if I wanted to invent the next great widget and I'm in the prototyping stage where I am like hand carving this widget or 3D printing it, let's say, I'm not simultaneously going to build a manufacturing facility that can stamp out 10,000 of these a minute. I don't know the shape of the thing. I don't know if 10,000 is the right amount. Like, it makes no sense to build all this vast automation and process around something that I might never actually produce at scale. I have to do the thing where I'm still prototyping and figuring out, does this widget work the way I want it to? Is there a fit here? And it sounds like you're encountering that same thing where, yes, IAC and CI/CD and all these like big automation things are great if you're running at that scale, if you need that efficiency. But at the beginning stage, it's like, no, I just need to do the thing that might actually make me money.
Exactly, because I won't exist tomorrow, right?
Right.
There's a good chance I won't exist more, right? Like 90%. I think it's super interesting. I've always been kind of a proponent of like good software engineering practices and testing and infrastructure as code, and like I've always been kind of like the guy who shouts all the time, who tries to make sure that everybody's. And I feel like when you have this really, like, again, as a very early stage startup, when you have this really clear focus, and it's really easy to understand why these things are not important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not sure if I'm converted to your question earlier, right, about infrastructure and application. I do think that the other thing that, we learned a lot about as we were kind of thinking about Wing was Kubernetes. Because basically coming out of Amazon, AWS is like almost no use of Kubernetes. And serverless was kind of like the big hype when we started the CDK. And the CDK is definitely very useful for serverless applications because it kind of blurs the line between infrastructure and application. And so CDK and Wing kind of like, there were many times where we could debated about, is Wing a serverless programming language, right? Like, is this about serverless, right?
Right.
And the thing that happened, a couple of years into starting Wing was that we basically couldn't find enough serverless customers. We couldn't find enough serverless shops, people who actually use serverless as their primary programming model.
Mm-hmm.
But we definitely could find a lot of Kubernetes shops.
Right.
And I think that's also happened in the market in the past few years. And I think it's also very interesting, again, coming from kind of like the serverless direction, because I've seen like very large scale serverless systems built at Amazon very successfully, very kind of day two oriented in that sense. And I think what happens with Kubernetes is that Kubernetes, in a sense, perpetuates this decoupling between application and infrastructure. When you're a developer running on Kubernetes, the developers are containerized, right? Like their world is just the thing that runs inside the container, right? And maybe they have like a URL of the database, right? And they access the database. But like Kubernetes is not encouraging teams to leverage cloud services, which could be a very interesting philosophical question, strategic question about Amazon versus Google versus, you see where I'm going with this. But he was like,
Yeah.
Ned is intrigued.
No, I'm just thinking about it's so easy to spin up some pods to make use of the secrets inside of Kubernetes, the add DNS, the networking, all of the features that are just built into Kubernetes. If I want to deploy something as an application, as soon as I need to step outside of that infrastructure, as soon as I need a bucket or an RDS instance, or I don't know, any number of different services that might be outside of that cluster, now I have to get another team involved.
Hmm.
And so either the solution is I need to make those services provisionable, if that's a word, to be provisioned using the native Kubernetes languages by like creating these custom resources.
Yeah, cross
Hmm.
plane, blah, blah, yeah.
Exactly. Or I need to streamline farming it out to another team or add an abstraction layer. Well, I don't even know that's what's being provisioned. I just say, okay, I need a database. And then, yeah, like a custom resource, like a
Yeah.
crossplane goes and provisions that database for me on whatever cloud platform I want.
Or I'm just not going to use a cloud service,
Yeah.
which I've seen more actually than you want, right? Like, it's like, why did you implement this distributed queue? Like, what was the reason? It's like, the DevOps team, they didn't want us to use Kafka, so we're just implemented something with like in-memory arrays, right?
Right. So it's all still sitting in the cluster taking up resources.
Exactly. So I think like that's another thing that like there was no good fit between the model, like the problem that Wing solved didn't solve a particular problem in the Kubernetes space. There wasn't like an owner that you could go to and say, "Hey, this is your problem," because the developers were living in like La La Land, right? Like they were like just running their containers and building their containers, and there was definitely pain around running the container within a cluster and doing the remote thing and trying to figure out how to, right, like, so there is a development experience issue, but it's not the developer and experience issue that we were trying to solve. And then if you go to the DevOps team didn't care about the application in a way, right? Like they cared mostly about their Kubernetes cluster. That was the biggest pain, is like how to run the cluster and maintain the cluster. And maybe they vended some templates, Helm charts and stuff like that for their developers. And that was kind of the boundary. And then if you needed something changed, then you call the DevOps and they would figure that out. And so, like, if you go to the Kubernetes shops, like, we couldn't find that there wasn't a good fit, right? Like, there wasn't like, oh, I can use this tomorrow and solve a real problem, right? Like for me. The other thing we learned after leaving Amazon, which is definitely not a Kubernetes shop, and most services at Amazon are serverless systems, and Kubernetes, in a way, the way it's structured, it kind of perpetuates this decoupling between application and platform, or the application and infrastructure, because it gives developers the ability to be containerized, right? Like the DevOps are able to build their environment in a way that developers are able to like be effective building their server or their container. Maybe they have to interact with a database or an S3 bucket, so they get secrets and they get environment variables, but that's the extent of it in a way. And for all intents and purposes, it discourages developers from leveraging more and more cloud services. Every cloud service is an event, right? Like it's like a big event. I remember talking to this team. We were interviewing them kind of as part of our product research, and they were saying, "Yeah, we just needed a new bucket last week, and finally the DevOps provisioned it in our dev environment, and I think that maybe in a month we'll get it in the production environment." And I'm like, "Oh my God, this is weird." But they were fine, right? Like it wasn't something that they were like, it didn't feel like a pain for them. This is what it takes to provisioning it. Because an S3 bucket is like a big event, right? Like it's not a new object,
Hmm.
Wait, it was like new bucket. You just said new bucket and you got a bucket.
Yeah. We've recently wanted to use the EFS service, which is, file shares that you can attach and multi-write across your pods, which is very useful. But we didn't have the CNI deployed. So I had to write some IAM policies, and then I had to mount it to the node, and then I had to deploy the EFS CNI and get that stable and redundant, and then write some other code. And it's like, yeah, every new service that's external to Kubernetes, there's definitely attacks there. It definitely
Yeah.
penalizes using cloud infrastructure versus Kubernetes infrastructure, for sure.
Very convenient for Google.
Absolutely.
Sorry for my conspiracy theories. No, I think it's really interesting, right? Like if you think about like the strategic kind of forces that are happening in the infrastructure world and the cloud world, and how Amazon leaned in very, very strongly into their strength, which is creating new services, because Amazon's operational model is really good at like distributed decision making. I think it's very interesting, kind of like coming from the retail space and blah blah blah. But Amazon's really good at like creating new services. It's like a muscle that Amazon has as a company. And so they created a strategy, a cloud strategy that emphasizes the value of this portfolio, right? Like you go to reInvent and you see this huge slide of like 150 different services on AWS. Is like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Like you're not even sure, but when you're at reInvent, it feels like a great thing, right? Like it feels like this is how it's supposed to work. And Google is coming from a very different mindset. I think engineering, from an engineering perspective, where they had this like huge Borg system and basically everything was an application, right? Like everything runs on this. And so it's like a very different philosophy from an engineering perspective. And AWS has definitely became very successful in the public cloud. And so I think it's interesting to see kind of like whether it was intentional or unintentional, how Kubernetes kind of leveled the playing field in a sense. Because if you go to Kubernetes shops, they have very little use of AWS services that are not EC2, S3, kind of like the foundational services.
Right.
Because of this difference, right?
Yeah. It's funny because I have conversations with Corey Quinn from time to time, and he gets to see a lot of Amazon bills. And he assures me that the vast majority of spend is still those core constructs of EC2, S3, some RDS, and then, of course, all the network data transfer charges.
Of course.
But yeah, like the vast majority of what people are spending real money on is these basic constructs, and the 125 other services that Amazon has, that's a rounding error on most of these bills.
Super interesting. Very, very interesting. And I think the AI era, it's even more emphasized in a way because of, what we talked earlier about redundant abstraction layers and or like maybe we really don't need all these high level things, right? Like maybe if I want to do something, all I need is some compute and storage and that's it, right? And the AI will figure out how to use those constructs to serve me. So I think it's interesting to see the disruption to the cloud in my mind coming from Vercel Supabase lovable in a way, right? Like if you look at like new companies, even us, like we're not hosted on AWS. And we're both Amazonians. Me and my co-founder are both Amazonians. We have vested interest in the success of Amazon.
Right.
But we're like, this is too easy, right? Like, why would I spend time like even provisioning Lambda functions or provisioning like serverless things I don't need this. Like, this is just working. It gives me like a lot of the capabilities that I need at this point. Obviously, it's going to change. And in a way, I think like most of the new stuff that's being built right now, the day one stuff, is built using these new AI tools and new AI programming language environments. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the public cloud.
Yeah. And the patterns that those models were trained on are the patterns that are publicly available. So they do seem to favor what they could find on GitHub and, what examples were typed up in blogs and whatnot. And that gets back to a conversation we were having maybe before we started recording about how AI is trained on that day one example that is not always a realistic example. Because when you get to day two, the proviso at the bottom of the example is don't run this in production.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're running it in production.
You don't even know because you haven't read it. You just copied and pasted it from chat to your code.
Right, right, exactly.
Or anymore, have an MCP that can run AWS commands and you say, looks great, go build it. And it does.
Yeah.
And it's terrible.
Yeah.
I'm curious if Winglang continues as a project, beyond this, because I think we didn't even make this differentiation earlier in the episode,
Right.
but there was the service that you were running, and then there was the language itself. The service is shut down, but is the project still active? Are people still contributing and looking at it?
Not really. Yeah, I think like you need a maintainer, right? Like you need someone to lead. And because this project was maintained by a company, right? Nobody picked up the baton. And it's a big project, right? Like it's not a small little thing. It's like the surface area is very big. There's a programming a compiler and a standard library and a debugging tool. And like it's just very big and very elaborate, which I also think was a mistake in hindsight. But it's very hard to maintain stuff like that. And so you need someone to be super engaged and like full time almost to run something like that. And so we see people come in to the Discord sometimes and GitHub, but it's not actively maintained, unfortunately.
Gotcha. I'm going to ask something that might be a little controversial. So feel free to give me your hot take or not. Based on what you've learned from the CDK and also Winglang, what do you think are the good solutions out there that people should pursue? And maybe what people should avoid based off of these lessons learned around IAC and deploying infrastructure with code?
I still really like the CDK.
Okay.
I really like tools that are useful and they actually prove that they work. And I really loved Winglang. And at some point, I'm like, I fell out of love, right? But I do think the CDK is still a really, really good tool. And, I've met many, many people who use it all the time and love it and enjoy it. And I've actually just tried to use it here the first time last week. Is like, this is actually really nice. This is helping me. And so I still really like the CDK. And I think like in many ways, if you build on AWS, then I would definitely prefer the CDK on something like Terraform, because when you're using Terraform, you're working at a lower layer of abstraction. Like people don't realize that really, but you're actually working at the assembly level of AWS and not at the high level language level.
Right.
And so many of the kind of like nuances of like how to integrate AWS services to do stuff, like Tyler was talking about connecting EFS to a Kubernetes cluster, for example. I don't know for sure, but I would bet there's probably an API in the EKS CDK construct that allows you to add EFS to your nodes. And it's probably like 2 lines of code or 1 line of code. And it'll do everything that you just said. And so I think like people who are kind of saying AWS is this is where we're building, this is kind of pragmatically, I think AWS CDK is still a really great tool. I think Terraform is also really great. Terraform, OpenTofu, it's definitely been about the ecosystem around it and the provider ecosystem. And so like if you're building across multiple services and multiple types of resources across multiple cloud providers, I don't think there's a pizza shop that you won't have a Terraform provider at this point. So it is like the most established ecosystem. I like Pulumi. I really like the Pulumi folks. I really think that they're coming from the right place, right? Very, very similar approach to the CDK. But to be honest, I have never used Pulumi in anger, right? Like in real production. So
Right.
I don't know if that's a phrase, but so I can't say if like beyond the kind of like I'm familiar with their architecture, I'm familiar and I know the team. The team is very, very strong. Are there any new tools in the last 6 months that I haven't heard of?
The only one we had a conversation with Adam Jacob about System Initiative, but that's still very much in the like testing and development phase.
Yeah,
I don't think anybody's using it for production yet. So
yeah, and it's coming at it from a very different perspective and approach.
for sure.
I love his thinking. He's so creative and so inspiring. And yeah, I have to admit that I also haven't used it in production, and so but it's very cool.
Yeah.
It is. It was really cool. We got to see a little demo as part of the podcast interview. It was really awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. If folks want to get in touch with you and follow you on your new venture, how can they find you on the internet?
Twitter, LinkedIn, yeah, the normal stuff.
Perfect. We'll have links to all of that. Wonderful. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, guys. It was really fun.
Thanks to Elad Ben-Israel for appearing on Day 2 DevOps, and virtual high fives to you, dear listener, for tuning in. If you have suggestions for future shows, we'd love to hear them. Really, we would. Hit either of us up on LinkedIn, we're always online, unfortunately, or send some feedback via packetpushers.net/follow-up. You can find me, Kyler Middleton, blogging over on letsdodevops.com, and my fantastic co-host, Ned Bellavance, at nedinthecloud.com. We're both very active on LinkedIn. Stop by and say hello.
If you like engineering-oriented shows like this one, visit packetpushers.net/subscribe. All of our podcasts, newsletters, and websites are there. It's all nerdy content designed for your professional career development. Till next time, just remember that doing DevOps is awesome, and so are you.